The wind didn't just howl through Griffith's Hollow tonight, it screamed. Like the land itself was warning him. Wesley Calder stood frozen by the window, his breath misting in the frigid air, watching two riders cut across the dying plain. No cart, no escort, just two women, moving like they belonged to the ghosts that haunted this place. He didn't know their names yet, but something in the way they rode their silence, their defiance against the storm, told him one truth: trouble had finally found him again. The wind had grown fiercer, and the gray sky above threatened a storm. As he grabbed his coat and stepped outside, the cold hit him, stinging his face like 1,000 needles. The horses were drawing closer, their hooves sinking into the softening ground, and the riders, two women, were a stark contrast to the wildness surrounding them. They were alone, with no man to guide them, no protector. Wesley's instincts flared at the sight. He had learned long ago not to invite trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him anyway. He stood tall, watching them, waiting to see what they wanted. The younger woman's face was hard to read, but the older one, with a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, seemed more resigned. She held her reins steady, her eyes scanning the landscape like someone who had seen too much of it. They stopped their horses just short of the cabin, their figures framed against the dying light of the day. The silence stretched between them, a heavy thing, the kind of silence that only the wild could produce, where words weren't necessary, and everything that needed to be said was spoken with a glance. "You're a bit far from home," Wesley said, his voice quiet, not out of fear but out of respect for the land. The younger woman looked at him, her eyes sharp but tired, like a woman who had borne too much and could carry no more. "We ain't got one," she said, her voice a rough whisper, as if the wind itself had stolen her words. The older one's voice broke the silence next, soft and even. "We waited, but he's not coming back." Wesley glanced past them, where a ruined church stood, eaten by time, a place that had once been a symbol of something greater, now left to rot beneath the weight of its own history. There were no signs of life beyond the women, no cart, no mule, just the faint, eerie stillness of a world gone by. The wind, restless as ever, caught the bucket tied to the well, making it sway as if caught in an invisible dance. "How long you been here?" he asked, his voice quieter now. 3 weeks, the older woman answered, her words falling heavy between them. Wesley felt the weight of the answer in his chest, a sharp pang that reminded him too much of his own life. He didn't ask them for help. They hadn't begged or bargained, and that made it harder to walk away. If they had been weeping or wailing, he might have turned his back and convinced himself that someone else would come along. But instead, they just sat there, waiting, as though turning into stone was an option they had considered, and maybe even found peace with. "Storm's coming tonight," the younger woman said, almost as a statement to herself. Wesley looked toward the horizon, where dark clouds were gathering, thick and heavy. The first rumble of thunder rolled in from the west. He nodded to himself, then turned his gaze back to the women. "You'll stay at my cabin tonight," he said, not offering charity, but simply stating a fact. The older woman, who had said so little, lifted her gaze, the shadows of the past still clinging to her eyes. "We don't take charity," she said, a statement that held more weight than Wesley had expected. He scratched his jaw, considering her words, then squinted at the dark line of thunderclouds creeping in. "You'll freeze before pride feeds you," he said, almost to himself. After a beat, he added, "Ain't charity, cabins lonely, fires already lit." She didn't move at first, but then, slowly. She nodded. "Martha," she said, her voice soft. "Grace," the younger woman said, her voice lower, almost drowned by the sound of the wind. They didn't ask for anything, but something in the way they stood told him all he needed to know. They weren't begging, but they had been waiting, and maybe that was enough to earn a place by his fire. The ride back to the cabin was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The snow under the horses' hooves crunched with each step, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Wesley didn't mind the silence. It felt right, in a way. When they reached the cabin, the wind howled like something alive, a constant reminder of the world outside. The door creaked as he opened it, and the scent of pine and old wood mixed with the faint odor of stew that had long gone cold on the stove. "Water in the basin," Wesley said, his voice barely a whisper as they stepped inside. "You can wash. There's a cot by the hearth, and my room's back yonder. I'll take the barn." "You're not," the younger woman said, stepping toward him. He held up a hand. "Barn's warmer than you think. Roof don't leak." She hesitated, glancing around the room as if it were all a dream, about to collapse if she moved wrong. She brushed her fingers along the edge of the table, as though it might splinter under her touch. "I got eggs, some beans, bread, old, but chewable," Wesley added, breaking the silence. The women unpacked nothing, for they had nothing, just each other and the clothes that sagged on their bones. Dinner passed in quiet. 3 plates, 3 wooden spoons, and the crackling fire that seemed to speak more than any of them ever could. The wind outside howled louder, and the storm broke, lashing against the windows like something angry and wild. As the storm grew more fierce, Grace's eyes fluttered closed near the flames, exhaustion pulling her under like a tide. Her face, more relaxed now in sleep, looked younger, less guarded, less pained. Martha, without a word, pulled a quilt over Grace, her movements tender, muddled with protectiveness. She was his favorite, Martha said softly, not looking up from the fire. Wesley didn't respond. He stirred the fire, watching as the flames danced in the hearth. He didn't need to ask what she meant. He could hear the story in her voice, the quiet stretched between them, unspoken and thick with years of unhealed wounds. Wesley's mind wandered back to the church ruins, the place where so many had found solace, only to have it torn apart by time and memory. They were both women of a broken world, and perhaps that was why they had come to him. Later, as the women prepared to settle in for the night, Wesley took his coat and stepped back out into the storm. The wind hit him in the face the moment he stepped outside. He welcomed it, the cold biting at his skin as he stood for a moment under the empty sky, listening to the wind tear at the earth. He hadn't expected them to come, and yet, here they were, and for the first time in years. Wesley wondered if maybe the world had found him again. As the storm raged on, Wesley's thoughts drifted to the women inside, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel quite so alone. The door creaked open, and Wesley's heart skipped a beat. The sound of hooves echoed through the night, a distant, ominous reminder that the past was never truly gone. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, the silence was just as loud, as though the 3 of them were listening for something that was never going to come. The only sound that could be heard was the wind whipping through the cracks of the cabin and the faint crackle of the fire that had begun to burn low. Wesley sat in the chair by the hearth, his eyes steady on the flames, though his mind wasn't really on the fire. Wesley's thoughts had already wandered to the women, Martha and Grace. It had taken him a moment to realize that Martha and Grace were not their real names. Martha was really Evie, and Grace was Lila, names spoken like confessions, whispered only after the fire had burned low and trust had been earned. There was a weight in the air, thick with unspoken words, each one heavy with the past they all carried. Wesley knew better than most that silence had a way of becoming unbearable when left unchecked. He glanced across the room where Martha was seated at the small wooden table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had removed her shawl, but she still looked like a woman who was carrying more than her share of burdens. Her eyes were distant, as if she could see something beyond the cabin's walls, something far away, perhaps even unreachable. Grace was sitting on the cot, her back to the fire, her face partially illuminated by the dim light. She hadn't said much since they arrived, just nodded when Wesley spoke and barely made eye contact. It was clear that she was just as lost in her thoughts as Evie, but her silence was different. She didn't have the same sense of stoic composure as the older woman. There was something raw about Lila, a tension that seemed to vibrate in the very air around her. The fire shifted, sending a few sparks up into the chimney, breaking the quiet for a moment. Wesley leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and stared at the flames. His mind flickered back to the moment when he'd invited them inside, when he had opened the door to shelter them from the storm. There was a part of him that had hoped they'd be like all the others he had encountered in his life, people who needed nothing more than a roof over their heads and a place to rest. But these women, they weren't like that. They weren't asking for charity. They weren't even begging for help. They simply existed, in a way that made him feel like he was on the edge of something he didn't understand. "I know the storm's bad tonight," Wesley finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the room with a steady, calm resolve. "But it's going to get worse tomorrow. We'll need to be prepared." He wasn't sure why he spoke. He hadn't expected an answer. Evie's eyes flicked over to him, her gaze guarded. "We're not used to storms like this," she said, her voice flat, almost lifeless. "Back home, we never had to worry about this kind of weather." Wesley knew she wasn't talking about the storm. She was talking about something else, something buried deeper, perhaps even deeper than the land around them. He nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't press. There was no use trying to dig up things that people weren't ready to talk about. Lila shifted on the cot, her fingers gripping the edge of her blanket as if it were the only thing holding her in place. Her shoulders were tense, and her eyes were focused on the wall across the room, far away from the warmth of the fire. Wesley couldn't help but watch her quiet, but unmistakable vulnerability, her emotional walls that had been built up too high for anyone to scale. "You been on the road long?" he asked, his voice casual, though he didn't expect much in return. Lila's response was slow, measured, as if she were carefully selecting her words. 3 weeks. Maybe longer. Feels like it." Evie turned her head at that, her face softening for just a second. "Feels like longer," she echoed, almost to herself. Wesley didn't push them any further. He'd learned long ago that patience could sometimes reveal more than words ever could. He let the silence settle back in around them, letting the weight of their unspoken thoughts rest on his shoulders, too. The wind began to howl louder, rattling the cabin's walls. But there was something deeper in the air now, a sense of inevitability, as though the storm was merely the physical manifestation of all the emotions that had been simmering just below the surface for too long. Then, without warning, Lila spoke again, her voice quieter, but there was a tremor in it that Wesley hadn't heard before. "I didn't think I'd be running again," Grace said, her words barely a whisper over the crackling fire. "Not after all this time." Wesley's heart tightened. He couldn't be sure. But there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't just talking about physical distance. She was talking about the past, the one that had chased her down, no matter how far she ran. Evie's eyes narrowed slightly, and Wesley could tell she was listening too, though her face remained impassive. She shifted in her chair, the creak of the wood momentarily filling the silence between them. "You can't outrun a storm like this," Wesley said, the words slipping from his mouth before he could stop them. He wasn't sure what he meant, but something in the air felt like a reckoning was coming. Lila didn't look at him when she responded, but her voice was steady. "I'm not running anymore," she said, and Wesley could hear the quiet defiance in her words. "I don't think I have it in me to run anymore." The fire crackled louder, and for a moment, the wind seemed to ease, as if giving them space to breathe. But that stillness was short-lived. A sound, faint, but unmistakable, broke through the quiet of the cabin, the creaking of the door, as if someone had pushed it open just a crack. Wesley's hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt, his muscles tensing as he rose from his seat. His eyes flicked toward the door, his mind racing. No one should be out there, not with the storm raging like it was. Evie looked at him, her expression suddenly alert, her protective instincts taking over. Lila, too, was on her feet now, her eyes wide and her body rigid. Wesley moved toward the door, his steps quiet but deliberate. He reached for the handle slowly, pausing for a heartbeat, feeling the cold air slip through the cracks in the doorframe. When he opened it, the cold slapped him in the face, but what he saw made his blood run cold. A figure stood at the edge of the porch, just out of the light, but there was no mistaking who it was. A voice sliced through the storm, sharp and mocking. Still hiding, Wesley Jesse Crowley stepped into the light, rain sliding off the brim of his hat, his eyes burning with the kind of hatred that belonged to the dead, or those who wished they were. Wesley's jaw clenched. The past had come back faster than he'd ever expected. As Jesse Crowley stepped into the cabin's dim light, Wesley's hand tightened around the handle of the door, knowing there was no escaping the trouble that had just arrived. Wesley felt the weight of the past press against him, as if the very walls of the cabin were ready to crack under the burden of all the secrets it held. Jesse Crowley stood in the doorway, his shadow long against the dim light of the cabin. The cold wind whipped around him, tugging at his coat, but it didn't seem to faze him. He was a man who had lived through worse than a storm, and Wesley could see it in the lines of his face, the years spent on the wrong side of every good decision. He could smell the past on Crowley as if the man carried the dust of every misstep, every betrayal. The women stayed behind him, their eyes wide with fear and confusion, unsure what to make of this man who seemed to appear out of nowhere. Evie was already moving toward the back of the room, her hands trembling ever so slightly, while Lila stood frozen, her eyes locked on Crowley, the tension in her posture telling Wesley all he needed to know. This man was not a stranger to her, but someone who had left scars long before they ever crossed paths again. Wesley didn't move, didn't flinch. His mind raced as he forced himself to stay still as the night outside, as still as the ghosts that seemed to rise in the darkness. He didn't need to ask why Crowley was here. He already knew. "Figured you'd still be here," Crowley muttered, his voice low but carrying an edge of bitterness. "Didn't think a man like you would leave all this behind." Wesley. Thought you might have learned your lesson by now. Wesley's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had learned many lessons over the years, most of them the hard way. The past had always had a way of creeping back up on him, like a wild animal that he could never quite outrun. Crowley was just another reminder of the mistakes he had made, the choices he'd regretted. I'm not looking for trouble. Crowley, Wesley finally said, his voice steady but not without its own weight. I've had my fill of it. Crowley stepped forward, ignoring the cold that tried to push him back. His boots creaked on the wooden floor, a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet cabin. He eyed Wesley for a long moment, sizing him up, the years of history between them stretching thin like an old, frayed rope. Funny thing about trouble, Wesley, Crowley said with a sneer. It finds you. No matter how far you run, you're not done with it yet. Not by a long shot. Wesley stepped closer to the door, blocking Crowley's path into the cabin. His hand rested lightly on the knife at his belt, but he didn't make any sudden moves. He had learned to be patient when it came to Crowley, because nothing ever happened quickly when it came to men like him. Why are you here? Wesley asked, his voice sharp now, carrying a quiet menace. What do you want? Crowley smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I came to see what you're hiding. Calder, he said, his gaze flicking over Wesley, then shifting to Evie and Lila, who had both positioned themselves by the hearth, unwilling to leave the safety of the fire. I heard you've taken in some strays. Thought maybe I'd pay you a visit. Wesley's eyes narrowed. He knew exactly what Crowley meant. The strays were the women, Evie and Lila, and Crowley knew that much more than just shelter had been offered. But Wesley wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a fight. Not tonight. Not now. I don't owe you anything. Crowley, Wesley said, his voice low. You've got no claim here. Crowley didn't flinch. He took another step forward, his boots scraping against the wooden floor, and Wesley could see the hunger in his eyes. The hunger for something more than just conversation. Maybe not, Crowley said, his voice hardening. But I'm willing to bet someone else might. There it was, the old threat. The one Wesley had seen 100 times before. Crowley wasn't here for answers. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to dig up old bones and make Wesley regret every step he'd ever taken to put the past behind him. Get out, Crowley, Wesley said, his voice finally rising, the calm edge replaced by something darker, more demanding. But Crowley didn't move. He held Wesley's gaze for a long moment, sizing him up once more, before his lips curled into a grin. Fine, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. But you should know that trouble's already here. Wesley, you can't hide from it forever. You can't hide from her, either. Martha flinched at the mention of her. Wesley's eyes darted to her, but she looked away quickly, her face ashen. Crowley turned on his heel, his spurs jingling as he walked toward the door. I'll be back, he said, pausing in the doorway and casting one last glance at the cabin. Don't forget. Calder. Not everyone's as forgiving as you. Not everyone's as quiet as you. With that, Crowley stepped back into the night, the cold wind sweeping in behind him. The door creaked shut, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Wesley stood there, rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the faint sound of hooves moving off in the distance, growing fainter and fainter until the world outside was once again quiet. But the silence inside the cabin was different now. It was heavy with unspoken words, thick with the weight of things that could no longer be ignored. Lila was the first to break the silence, her voice soft and trembling. Who was that man, she asked, her words barely above a whisper. Wesley turned to face her, his jaw set, his eyes hardening as he took a step toward her. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he couldn't afford to let it show in his own. "A ghost from my past," he said, his voice rough. "Someone I should have put to rest a long time ago." Evie, who had remained silent, her back turned to them, spoke next, her voice quiet but full of sorrow. "He was with us, before, when we had the church," she said, her words heavy with old pain. "He was part of everything that went wrong." Wesley's gaze flicked to Evie. He knew the past she spoke of. He knew it too well. Crowley had been part of the preacher's betrayal, part of the reason why these women had been left stranded. But Wesley had never expected him to show up here, not after all these years. "Why is he here now?" Lila asked, her eyes wide, filled with confusion. Wesley's hand tightened around the edge of the table, the old scars of the past beginning to stir once more. He had tried to bury them, but like all things buried in this land, they had a way of rising up again. "He's not finished," Wesley said, his voice low, full of the weight of history. "And neither am I." The wind picked up again, the door rattling on its hinges as Wesley stared at the fading outline of Crowley's figure disappearing into the darkness. He knew that the past was coming back, and this time, there would be no running from it. The wind had died down, but the air was thick with tension, as though nature itself held its breath, waiting for the storm of emotions about to break inside the cabin. Wesley stood by the door, watching the wind curl against the bare trees outside, their skeletal branches twisting in the pale light of the waning moon. The storm had passed, but the weight of what had happened lingered. Jesse Crowley's words echoed in Wesley's mind, stirring up memories he'd tried to bury. The past had come knocking in the dead of night, and Wesley wasn't sure if he was ready for what was about to follow. The sound of Evie moving behind him broke the stillness. Her soft footsteps were like the crackle of dried leaves, barely perceptible, but heavy, with meaning. She didn't say anything, but Wesley could feel her presence, her anxiety pressing against his back. "He's gone," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "For now." Wesley nodded, though he didn't take his eyes off the door. The night felt heavier somehow, as though the very air was thick with anticipation. He knew Crowley wasn't done with them. He could feel it deep in his bones. Evie stepped closer, her voice barely audible. "What are we going to do?" Wesley didn't answer right away. He wanted to reassure her, but the truth was that he didn't know. The man who had left them to die was the same man who had come to collect on old debts, debts that weren't his to collect. Crowley had always been a man of few words, but many promises, and none of them were good. "I'm not sure yet," Wesley said quietly. He turned to face her, his expression a mask of resolve. "But I won't let him hurt you." Evie's eyes flicked toward the window, her hands trembling at her sides. "I'm tired, Wesley. Tired of running. Tired of being afraid." Wesley wanted to say something, to tell her it would be over soon, but he knew better. He could feel the storm coming, not just in the air, but in the very hearts of the people around him. Evie had been broken by betrayal. Lila, too. And him. He'd carried his own burdens for too long. "We'll be ready," he said finally, his voice firm, though it felt like a promise he might not be able to keep. There was a moment of quiet between them, and for a brief second, Wesley allowed himself to imagine a life where he wasn't always looking over his shoulder. But the thought didn't last long, and soon, the heavy silence of the cabin returned. Lila, who had been sitting by the hearth, rose quietly from her seat, her movements slow but deliberate. She had barely spoken since Crowley's visit, but Wesley could feel the weight of her gaze. She was watching him, studying him, like she was searching for something. "You should have told me about him," she said, her voice soft but sharp, cutting through the stillness. Wesley didn't flinch. "I didn't think he'd come back." Lila didn't respond, but her eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't angry, at least not at him, but the hurt was clear. She had spent so much time hiding from the world, from people like Crowley, that she hadn't seen the danger coming until it was already on their doorstep. "Why didn't you fight him?" Lila asked, her voice soft but pointed. Wesley met her gaze, his face hardening. "Fighting him would have meant more blood spilled. I thought keeping him out of here was the better choice." Lila's expression softened, but there was something else in her eyes now. A flicker of understanding, perhaps, or something even more dangerous curiosity. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "We can't hide forever," she said quietly. "Not from him. Not from ourselves." The words hung in the air between them, thick and heavy, with unspoken truths. Wesley didn't know what to say to that. He knew she was right, but he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it just yet. A shadow flickered past the window, silent, deliberate. Wesley's stomach tightened. No knock, no warning. When the door swung open, the cold night air carried in a man who looked like he'd been standing outside, listening for far too long. His mind raced, every muscle in his body primed for a fight. Though he didn't know what was coming, he reached for the door handle slowly, his breath catching in his throat. When he opened it, his eyes widened, his heart thudding in his chest. A man stood in the doorway, a stranger to the cabin, but someone Wesley recognized from long ago. His face was drawn, his features weathered by the years, but his eyes were clear. "Didn't expect to find you here," the man said with a dry chuckle. "But I guess the world's smaller than it seems." "Huh." Wesley's hand tightened on the doorframe, his mind reeling as he took in the man's familiar face. He was someone from the past, someone who had been there during the days when everything had gone wrong. "What do you want?" Wesley asked, his voice low, barely more than a whisper. The man, whose name Wesley had almost forgotten, smiled a sad, knowing smile. "I came to tell you that Crowley's not the only one who's been looking for you," he said quietly. "There's more coming. Wesley, there's more than just him." The world outside seemed to grow darker at that moment, as if the shadows were closing in, wrapping the cabin in a blanket of uncertainty and fear. The fire crackled behind Wesley, a stark contrast to the cold that had just entered the room. Wesley didn't say anything at first, his mind racing. Crowley had never come alone. And now, this man, this old ghost from his past, was standing in front of him. And Wesley realized with a sinking feeling that he had only been fooling himself to think he could outrun it all. "What do you mean?" Wesley asked, his voice barely more than a rasp. The man's smile faded, and he stepped forward, lowering his voice. "I'm telling you, Wesley, it's not over. Not by a long shot." The stranger's words echoed in the cabin, and Wesley felt the weight of them settle deep in his chest. As the wind howled outside, he knew, deep down, that the fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about facing the ghosts of the past, the ones that never truly went away. The ground beneath Wesley's feet felt like it might give way, as though the earth itself was waiting to swallow the secrets everyone was keeping. The man at the door stood there, his face familiar but distant, as though time had placed miles between them. Wesley could see it in the way he held himself, the weary tilt of his shoulders, the dust that clung to his boots. It had been years, too many years, but Wesley could still remember the name that had once meant something more than it did now. "Cliff," Wesley said quietly, his voice rough with disbelief. He hadn't expected to see this man again. Not here. Not after all this time. Cliff didn't smile, didn't offer any comfort. He just stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room, taking in everything with the practiced ease of a man who had seen too much of the world's darkness. "I figured you'd be here," Cliff said, his voice gravelly, but steady. "Funny how fate works. Huh? One day you're hiding from it. The next, it finds you anyway." Wesley didn't move. He could hear the wind picking up again, howling through the cracks in the cabin. But it felt far away, like it was happening in another world. His world had just shrunk to the size of the man standing in front of him, the man who had once been his closest companion, now standing there with news that weighed heavier than the storm outside. "What do you want?" Cliff Wesley asked, his voice low, guarded. Cliff glanced over his shoulder at the women, Evie and Lila, still standing by the hearth, their faces tense, their expressions unreadable. He didn't seem to care. His gaze shifted back to Wesley, narrowing slightly. "I came to tell you that Crowley isn't the only one who's looking for you." Wesley's pulse quickened, his mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle started to click into place. It wasn't just Crowley. It was never just Crowley. There was always someone else, someone from the past who had a score to settle. The men who rode with Crowley, Wesley asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it from Cliff's lips. Cliff nodded, his face hardening. "Yeah. They've been trailing you for days now, waiting for the right moment to strike. I'd say that moment is about to come." Wesley's thoughts raced, a mixture of disbelief and frustration flooding his chest. He had hoped, foolishly, that the years had erased everything his past, the things he'd done, the things that had been done to him. But it seemed that wasn't how things worked. The past didn't just vanish. It lingered like the dust on a forgotten trail, waiting to catch up with you when you least expected it. Grace stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Who are these men? What do they want?" Wesley could see the confusion and fear in her eyes, the rawness of the pain that hadn't yet been dealt with. She had been through enough already, and now, here they were again, dragged back into a war they didn't even know existed. Cliff's gaze softened just a fraction, as if he could sense the weight of her question. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "They want revenge. Lila. And they're not gonna stop until they get it." Evie's hand tightened around the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Revenge for what she asked, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Cliff didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, as if the very landscape itself could offer him some kind of comfort. "For the preacher," he said finally, his words heavy with a weight Wesley hadn't expected. "For what happened with him. You know as well as I do that Crowley and his crew never forgave anyone who turned their back on him." Wesley could feel the air grow thick with tension, as if the walls of the cabin were closing in on him. He had never wanted to talk about the preacher, never wanted to bring up those years of betrayal, of cruelty disguised as faith. But now, it seemed, there was no way to avoid it. "I never wanted any part of that," Wesley muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I tried to leave it behind." Cliff stepped forward, his face now hard as stone. "You can't leave it behind. Wesley, it's part of you, part of all of us. And it's come back to claim what it lost. The room fell silent. Wesley could feel the weight of those words pressing down on him, smothering him with a truth he'd spent so long trying to avoid. The preacher's betrayal, the way he had used faith to manipulate and destroy it, had been a curse on all of them. And now, it seemed, that curse had come home to roost. Lila spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Wesley met her gaze, his eyes softening just a little. "We stand our ground. We face them. It's the only way to end it." Cliff looked between them, his eyes narrowing as he took in their resolve. "You're a stubborn man, Wesley. Always have been. But there's no running from this. Not anymore." Wesley nodded slowly, his mind set on what had to be done. He'd spent so many years running from the past, from the people who had torn his life apart. But now, there was nowhere left to run. The past had caught up with him, and it was time to face it, no matter the cost. "We'll need supplies," Wesley said, his voice calm but determined. "Food, ammunition. We can't let them catch us unprepared." Cliff nodded, his eyes hardening. "I'll help. But don't think for a second this is over. It's just the beginning." Wesley turned to Evie and Lila, his eyes searching theirs. There was fear there, but there was also something else, something stronger, something that had been born from the fire they had all been forced to walk through together. "We'll get through this," Wesley said, his voice steady. "But we do it together. All of us." The wind howled again, louder this time, and the fire flickered, casting long shadows across the cabin. Outside, the land was silent, still, waiting. But within these walls, the storm was only just beginning. As Wesley turned back to the window, the distant sound of hooves echoed through the night air, and he knew without a doubt that the storm had come for them all. The truth always comes at a cost. Sometimes it's just a matter of when you're willing to pay. Wesley sat by the hearth, the fire crackling softly as the shadows in the cabin grew longer, stretching across the walls like specters from the past. He had never been one for much reflection, but tonight was different. The weight of the past hung on him like the storm clouds that loomed outside, heavy and unyielding. Cliff had left not long ago, his words still echoing in Wesley's mind. The past wasn't done with them, not by a long shot. Crowley and his men weren't just looking to settle old scores, they were coming for everything Wesley had tried to rebuild. And the ghosts of that old life were rising again, threatening to tear apart the fragile peace he had worked so hard to create. He glanced across the room, where Evie was sitting at the small table, her eyes distant. The storm had passed, but something inside her still churned. Her hands, once so steady, now trembled slightly as she cleaned the dishes. Lila, too, was quiet, standing by the window, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon as though she could see the trouble coming before it even reached them. Wesley didn't know how to make them understand, how to make them see that this fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about facing the ghosts they had all tried to outrun. The storm outside had been a warning, but it was the one brewing inside the cabin that would decide everything. "We don't have much time," Wesley said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Evie's head snapped up at the sound of his voice, her eyes searching his face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hoarse, as though the question had been sitting in her throat for too long. "They're coming," Wesley said, his voice steady but low. "Crowley and his men, they won't stop until they get what they want." Lila turned from the window, her face pale in the dim light. "What do they want?" "Wesley," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What are we supposed to do? The question hung in the air, unanswered for a moment. Wesley had never been good at explaining things. His actions spoke louder than his words. But now, he knew that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about fighting. This was about what they were fighting for. "We fight back," Wesley said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "We don't let them take anything from us. Not this time." Evie shook her head, her brow furrowing. "We can't just fight them all. There's too many of them." And what happens after her words were filled with a quiet desperation, as though she feared they were already too far gone. "There's no after," Wesley said, his eyes darkening. "If we don't stop them now, they'll keep coming. They won't stop until they've taken everything we have." Lila stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Wesley, as though she was weighing him for the first time. She had been so quiet, so distant since they had arrived. But now, her voice came out with a clarity that surprised him. "You're right," she said, her voice steady, almost calm. "They won't stop. Not unless we make them." Wesley looked at her, surprised by the strength in her words. The Lila who had arrived here wasn't the same woman standing in front of him now. She had been broken once, but now she stood tall, her shoulders squared, as though she were ready to face whatever came next. Evie didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, she stood up from the table and moved toward the door, her eyes distant as she opened it slightly, letting the cool air in. She stared out into the night, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "We can't do this alone," she said softly, her voice a whisper in the wind. "You're not the only one who has a past, Wesley. We all have one." Wesley's heart skipped a beat at her words. He knew she was right, but hearing her say it aloud, he wasn't sure he was ready for that. "I know," he replied, his voice low. "I know." But there was no time for regret. No time for hesitation. The door creaked open again, and Wesley's senses immediately went on alert. He could feel it, the weight of what was coming. The hooves. They were closer now. The sound unmistakable. Crowley's men had arrived. Evie moved toward the window, her eyes narrowing as she peered into the darkness. "They're here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Wesley's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't move. He knew this moment had been coming for days, maybe even longer. He could feel it in his bones, the reckoning. There was no escaping it now. "Get to the back," Wesley said, his voice sharp. "Take Lila with you. Don't let them see you." Evie didn't argue. She grabbed Lila's hand, pulling her toward the back of the cabin, but not before Wesley caught a glimpse of the fear in her eyes. It wasn't fear for herself. It was fear for them all. Wesley moved to the door, his hand steady on the handle as he stepped outside, his boots sinking into the dirt. The moonlight cut through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground as he made his way toward the edge of the cabin, where he could just make out the silhouettes of the riders. They were here. He didn't wait for them to get closer. He knew how Crowley worked, how his men worked. They wouldn't come charging in, guns blazing. They were patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Wesley wasn't going to give them that moment. He moved quickly, silently, slipping into the shadows like a man who had been born in them. His mind was clear, focused. He could hear the men's voices now, low, almost taunting. They were just outside the cabin, and Wesley knew that if he didn't act fast, they'd take everything he had fought to protect. He pulled the gun from his belt and checked it quickly, his fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. It was time. As Wesley stepped into the open, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The first gunshot rang out, shattering the stillness of the night. And Wesley knew that the time for running had passed. The reckoning had begun. A second shot answered, splintering the porch beam inches from his head. Wesley dropped to one knee, firing back into the darkness. A scream cut through the night, followed by the thud of a falling body. But more shadows moved between the trees, too many to count. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a promise that none of them would leave unchanged. The wind that howls through Griffith's Hollow still carries the scent of long-forgotten times. The kind that seem as far away as the horizon where the sky meets the land. A place where the past and present never truly fade. The land here, dusty and scarred by time, keeps secrets in its soil, stories that slip through the cracks like grains of sand in an endless desert. You can see it in the way the wildflowers bend toward the earth, soft petals pressing against the harshness of the world. The way a horse's hooves strike the earth, the sound as steady as a heartbeat, like a memory that never quite leaves you. Even in twilight, when the sky bleeds a deep purple and the stars whisper of things lost, you can feel it a tug at the heart, a question unanswered, a promise never fulfilled. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the soft creak of an old door, or perhaps the rustling of a letter forgotten in the corner of a drawer. The things that were once said, but never quite believed, still linger in the corners of the world, waiting to be remembered, like the women who walked quietly through the cabin's door, with nothing but the weight of their pasts and the silence of their stories. They came and left their mark in ways unseen, like the wind that sweeps through an old ghost town, rustling the dry leaves that once danced with laughter and now only settle in the cracks. The names fade, but the lives they lived, the weight they carried, stay. Wesley Calder, standing in the quiet after the storm, his boots worn by miles of regret, has carried the weight of things lost and things hidden too long. The people he tried to protect, the women who dared to trust him, and the ghosts of his own past have all taught him something the land itself could never deny. Honor, it seems, is like a wildflower. It can be buried under dust and the weight of years, but it'll still bloom in the right season. Sometimes, justice comes late, but it arrives just the same, with a quiet finality that can't be mistaken. The truth, too, though it may be buried in the forgotten corners of lives unlived, is never truly lost. It's the one thing that can't be taken from us, even when the world tries to erase it. The women who walked through Wesley's door, the ones who waited and fought for the truth to matter, have taught us that sometimes it's not the world that needs to believe the truth, it's the one person who holds it. The quiet strength of the forgotten ones, those who endure the long road of silence, of waiting for the right moment, for the right person to come along and say, "You matter." That's the true legacy they leave behind. It's a legacy not of noise or fanfare, but of something far more lasting, something real. So when you find yourself standing in the twilight, looking at a world that's moved on without you, remember this: there's honor in standing firm, even when the world whispers to you to walk away. There's peace in knowing that even if justice is late, it still has the power to heal. And as the wind sweeps through Griffith's Hollow, remember the women who showed us that being forgotten doesn't mean being erased. It means that the quiet strength of those who wait, who love, who forgive, has the power to save generations. If you believe that even the smallest truth has power, that the lost and the broken can still heal, then let it be known. If this story has stirred something in you, let your voice be heard. Type 1 if you believe in the power of redemption, in the strength of those who have been forgotten, and in the quiet justice that comes when we least expect it. And if you want to hear more of these stories, the quiet tales of the Old West, tales of love, loss, and the truth that still matters, subscribe to the Western Story Chronicles. Let the stories continue, and may the lessons they teach never be lost.